Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. And before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. Additionally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we start, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. On December 5th, we hope you'll join us for a conversation in which we discuss the ways that people are hearing messages about young people and engage with state and local leaders about their successful messaging and how they are ensuring that kids are a priority on the public agenda in their communities. On December 12th at 12:30 Eastern Time, we hope you'll join us for a Crucible of Practice Salon, which will focus on community messaging and building awareness about early childhood programs. More information and registration links will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Hattie Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Sierra. Hello to everyone joining today's webinar, Collaborating for Kids, Climate Change, Environmental Justice, and Advocacy. This is a bit of a new topic for our webinar series, and for that reason, I'm very excited for all of you to hear from today's panel. We're all aware of the effects of climate change on our planet and the impact that our environment can have on where we live. And depending on your own personal interests or maybe your profession, you may know more about the impact on us all as individuals. Yet we have not dug deep at GLR Learning Tuesdays about the intersection of climate, environment, and children. Today, we're beginning the CGLR conversation around these issues, what we need to know, how they connect, and what opportunities exist for partnership and collaboration as we learn more about why we need to pay attention and take action. Now I'd like to introduce our panel, and as a reminder, a link to speaker bios will be posted in the chat shortly. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Chantel, is unable to join today's session due to illness, but you'll still get to hear from 3 expert perspectives. First, we're joined by Dr. Eric Boucher, who is an assistant research professor of early childhood policy with the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. Next, Liz Hurtado, a national field manager with Ecomadres and the Moms Clean Air Force, is with us. And finally, we have Dr. Joshua Sparrow, Executive Director of Brazelton Touchpoint Center at Boston Children's Hospital. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our moderator now to get the conversation started, Lisa Guernsey, Director of the Learning Sciences Exchange, as well as Senior Editor and Strategic Advisor for the Education Policy Program at New America. Welcome, Lisa.
Great. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Hattie. It's really good to be with everybody today, and I'm really looking forward to digging into this topic, which is something that I've followed in bits and pieces, but haven't connected the dots on even myself. So there's a lot of great work that we can do in this conversation, and there's a lot of really exciting things to come that we'll be talking about today. We've got, on the one hand, climate change, we've got environmental justice, and we have child advocacy. And these are 3 incredibly important movements and issues. And they're kind of top of mind for all of us, I think, in many ways, even as we're thinking very particularly about what it means for helping children learn to read. All of these different pieces come into play. And yet there's a lot to do to coordinate across these 3 kind of movements and issues. And so today we're able to bring some really kind of smart people and organizations together to talk about what that can look like and what we really need to do to move forward. And one thing I wanted to mention before we jump into the questions that I'll have for our panelists is that later today, actually, so I'm here on the East Coast, and it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon East Coast, and at 7:30 p.m. today, this evening, on the so 7:30 Eastern time, NAEYC is hosting a webinar conversation on an action plan that's been released from Capita, and this is Planet Ed. And the report is called Unveiling Insights from the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan. There's going to be a lot of great stuff in there to talk about. So it's really wonderful that we have some folks here today on this webinar who will be able to give us some background on that, make some connections for us. But I also encourage many of you to do a double duty and get out there at 7:30 Eastern as well to listen to that. And so I'm happy to make sure we all have the link to that as well. Okay, so what we're going to do to get started is have each of our panelists just talk from their particular perspectives about where some of these intersection points are. And Joshua, I'd like to start with you and hear a little bit from you about the health impacts. As our physician on the panel and as someone who's really, I mean, I think so many people have followed your work over the years on what the adverse impacts can be on child health and well-being, depending on what kind of experiences children have in those early years. What have you been seeing that really matter and intersect with these issues of climate change? And I'm hoping, actually, Josh, can you?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Campaign for Grade Level Reading, for doing this topic, which, as you said, is an unusual one for you and perhaps new to some folks who are joining today. I'm going to try to fill in some of the gaps if I can. But let me start by situating the Brazelton Touchpoint Center in this work. Beginning back in the 1970s, Barry Brazelton's neonatal behavioral assessment scale was used to look at the impact of exposure to environmental toxins and neurotoxins during pregnancy on newborn behavior. And over the subsequent decades, it's been used in nearly 1,000 studies looking at many different aspects of newborn behavior, including new neurotoxins as they've come onto the market. And in fact, studies done back in the 1970s on the impact of exposure during pregnancy to leaded gasoline, which was a thing, for those of you who don't remember, those studies led to the banning of leaded gasoline. And it was an early instance of environmental injustice and racism, in as much as people who lived near highways tended to be people of color, and their fetuses and infants were much more closer to where leaded gasoline was being emitted and much more likely to be exposed. So our interest in this area goes back many decades. Now, about 20 years ago, maybe more now, one of the leaders in this field, Dr. Frederica Pereira, whose new book on climate change just came out last year, and it's really fabulous. It's a must read for anybody who's interested, and has a full-bodied action plan, and it's full of hope. It's not just doom and gloom. 20 or so years ago, Ricky Pereira, who had already been running the Children's Environmental Health Center at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University for decades already then, said to me, how do we get the early childhood world to take a look at environmental degradation caused by pollutants and climate change? She spent the subsequent years trying to figure out how. So I would urge you to look at her book. She's one of the leading researchers in this area. And it's a great summary of the research on the causes of climate change, the health impacts, particularly for fetuses, infants, and young children, as well as a wonderful compilation of success stories. And it's a strategy playbook. So she is truly an expert in this area with decades of knowledge and experience. And much of what I'll try to say briefly comes from her work and the work of other experts in the area of children's environmental health who have been trying to raise the alarm and get the attention of the early childhood world for many, many years. And sadly, it's only when we've been breathing in the wildfire smoke and cleaning up the water in our houses in these past couple of years that it finally is beginning to get attention. So I have a couple of points that I've selected to make for you. One is that we need to be clear about what causes climate change so that we can be clear about what we can do about it. There is no need for doom and gloom, but if we beat around the bush and don't talk about the fossil fuel industry being the primary contributor, we're not going to be clear about what we can do. So there are many reasons for us to be hopeful, but this is an emergency. So we need to act swiftly and strategically. We don't have time for more meetings. We don't have more time for white papers that collect dust. We don't have time we need more research. We know more studies. We know more than enough, and we have for decades to act. So let me say a little bit about what some of those things are. First of all, climate change is caused primarily by fossil fuel production and consumption for transportation. In the United States, it's about 29% of the contribution to carbon emissions. For electricity, for cooling, for heating, for many industries, and for the production of petrochemicals. And one of the things that Dr. Pereira talks about in her book is that now that the fossil fuel industry is seeing that their oil and gasoline eventually will no longer be used to power plants and transportation, they are trying to hold on to some use for gasoline and oil by shifting more and more of it to the production of petrochemical products. So these are things like plastics and cosmetics and body care products and all kinds of other things. Second, climate change is caused to a significant extent by cattle and by food waste. Roughly 40% of the food available in the US is actually wasted. And when it rots, it produces carbon emissions. Cattle produce a significant amount of climate change. So we have a role to play in reducing carbon emissions caused by cattle and food waste. Now, people often say, well, what's the point of me doing something that's just little old me? But if you multiply little old me by all of the other people and the growing numbers of people who are concerned and want to feel that they can be helpful and can be a part of the hope for the next generation, we can see that we can have an effect. Now, we want to be careful not to put all of the burden on individuals, because this is going to take international policy, national policy. It's going to take, true corporate accountability and not corporate greenwashing. But we all have a role to play. We can support and vote for political candidates who propose effective policies to stop climate change. And again, this is not beating around the bush. We have to talk about this. This is very much a matter of, which politicians are actually going to support policies that are going to cut carbon emissions. And we can also avoid putting into power politicians who are accepting donations from the fossil fuel industry and the PACs that push the fossil fuel industry cause. So what we can do about climate change is often thought about in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Now, mitigation means actions, and I'm going to use the word action because we got to get done with talking. We got to act. This is an emergency. Actions to prevent or reduce further carbon emissions, to prevent climate change from getting even worse. I think we'd probably all agree at this point it's bad enough. And the hardest hit countries on our little planet here are the ones that are least responsible for causing the problem. The United States is the #1 contributor to carbon emissions, with China, coming right up there alongside us. But the people who are actually having to leave where they live, the people immigrating who are at our borders, a lot of them are climate refugees because of the carbon emissions that the United States economy has benefited from far more than theirs have. So mitigation is acting to prevent further carbon emissions. Adaptation is actions to protect ourselves from current harmful climate change impacts like flooding or droughts or wildfires, among others. And resilience means putting in place actions that help us bounce back from harmful climate change events. Now, some of the actions that we are taking and need to take may actually be a combination of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. The next point I want to make, which is really important, and I think it's important when you look at this report, if you do, because it's got a ton of different strategies, and it's sort of hard to know how to prioritize them. We have to prioritize these efforts that are within our reach that will have the biggest impact. And what typically happens in crises is people who are well-meaning and well-intentioned want to help by doing the thing that they do, or by doing the thing that they were trained to do, or by doing the thing that they receive the funding to do. But those may not be the highest priorities. So there is little point in sticking our finger in the hole in the dike while the flood is pouring over the top. And there's no point in playing whack-a-mole. So here are some fairly vivid examples. This is a little bit of a trigger warning here. But as a physician, let me give you this example. If you're in the emergency room and someone comes in bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound, you're going to stop the bleeding first, then you're going to take out the bullet, then you're going to sew up the wound. And if there's trauma involved with the gunshot wound, that's going to come later. But you got to stop the bleeding first. And as I said, this is an emergency. And we know how to reduce carbon emissions in our own lives. And we can put in place politicians who will support those policies. And we've got a chance very soon. Second example I will give you as a child psychiatrist. When a child is being abused, you have to get that child to safety before you start treating the trauma. If you put that child in psychotherapy for trauma while they're actively being abused, you're actually making that child feel like no one is paying attention, no one is listening, and no one cares. So we need to support the people and organizations that have the specific skills and specific knowledge to stop the bleeding and to create safety. And we need to be sure that whatever we do in our agencies and in our professions do not get in their way and do not deflect limited resources from the critical survival steps that we have to put in place now. So we do need to identify what each of us can do in our own roles in mitigating climate change. And mitigating means reducing carbon emissions, as well as our roles in adapting to climate change and in building our resilience to climate change. But if we don't participate in slowing climate change, so that's not going to be curricula for children about what climate change is. If we don't participate in slowing climate change, the environments that we will have to adapt to will be increasingly harsh, and we will be bouncing back to environments that we would not want our children to have to inherit. So again, this is an emergency. We have to move swiftly and we have to be strategic. This is not doom and gloom. There is hope. There are successful approaches, but we need to not pull the covers away to early childhood, but need to support the folks who can stop the bleeding first and then look at what we can do there. So we do know enough about the impacts on children's health to act now. So first to say, the fossil fuel industry has known about the impact of carbon emissions resulting from fossil fuels for decades. And now that local governments are bringing lawsuits against the fossil fuel industries to try to be compensated for the billions of dollars that they are spending to clean up the floods and clean up the wildfires, it is being revealed that the fossil fuel industry has known for a very long time about the impact of carbon emissions resulting from fossil fuel use, and that they have very intentionally covered up and created confusion and doubt. So I tell that to you if you're still kind of wondering that it's been clear for a long time and we have been the victims of those efforts. This is the same playbook that the tobacco industry used with regard to cancer and cigarettes, and that the asbestos industry used with regard to the lethal lung disease that asbestos causes. So it's important to not mess around anymore. Fossil fuels are the main cause of climate change, and we've got to reduce our dependence on them. So in terms of health impacts, first, I wanted to be clear that some of the main contributors to carbon emissions are also air pollutants. So you may find in the children and families that you work with that climate change seems like maybe it doesn't happen here. It is actually happening in many places around the country, but for some people, it may not feel as concrete as something like pollutants in the air that are sending kids to the emergency room because their asthma is getting worse, or keeping them at home from a childcare or Head Start or school because their asthma is worse. So it's important for the folks working on climate change and the folks working on environmental pollution to understand we have common cause. And as we try to build coalitions to reduce carbon emissions, we may be able to engage some folks and activate some folks if we can focus on the air pollution that is also a marker for carbon emissions, and in some instances is actually itself also a form of carbon emission. So those air pollutants slash carbon emissions can actually weaken children's lungs and cause asthma. They can certainly exacerbate asthma. They can cause bronchitis. They can cause pneumonia. Another area for impact of climate change is extreme heat. And I put into the chat a link to a conversation that I did earlier this year with Dr. Rupa Basu, who is at the California Environmental Protection Agency, who's been a leader for several decades in the field looking at the impact of extreme heat on pregnancy and infancy. And what she and others have found is that extreme heat during pregnancy and in the early weeks and months during pregnancy can lead to premature birth and can lead to low birth weight. And both prematurity and low birth weight can be associated with learning disabilities and even loss of some IQ. And both of those can be associated with, if you need to monetize this, with significantly greater costs for special education and loss of lifetime earnings. Other examples of health impacts include housing insecurity and displacement. And if we care about the children of the world, I mentioned earlier that we now have climate refugees with their infants and young children at our doorstep on our borders. But we also have people who are being displaced in our own country as a result of fires and floods. We have food insecurity and famine as a result of extreme heat and drought. And of course, there is psychological trauma resulting from these extreme weather events. I also wanted to add that prolonged periods of extreme heat, in addition to being associated with premature delivery and low birth weight, have also been associated with increased numbers of stillbirths. And then one other area, which perhaps others will talk about.
Yeah, Josh, we'll have to, yeah, because I'm really excited to get to Liz as well. But
right, so I will just close by saying one other concrete area is our physical infrastructure for our children. So if we look at, now folks are paying attention because we're actually having to close child care centers because they are too hot for kids to go to. So I'll close with one example of where there's hope. If we look at our physical infrastructure and at the really important Inflation Reduction Act money that the Biden administration was able to bring to life with bipartisan support, there are dollars there to support infrastructure changes. And we need childcare centers that are better insulated, that are not dependent on air conditioners, that ultimately will, burn out our electrical grid. And we need better tree canopy cover around childcare centers. And the last point I'll make about tree canopy cover, because it's a nice concrete example of things that are within our reach, is that in the same city, communities of color with fewer material assets often have 10 degrees hotter temperature than the wealthier, whiter parts of the same city. And that is because there's more asphalt and less tree canopy cover in the community of color. So it's not hard to see what we could do to protect ourselves now from the impact of extreme heat. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say, but Ricky's book would be a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you for that, Josh. And so powerful the way you've laid that out. So Liz, I'd like to go to you in the context of environment and air quality in particular, and Josh did touch on this, but can you talk a little bit more about, well, your organization's work, but also the impacts on children and what we need to know in this arena?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Sparrow, for laying that, fantastic, thorough foundation for us. I think it's all important to know, where we're coming from and then the dire need that we're in right now. So I'm Liz Hurtado. I'm with Moms Clean Air Force. We're a community of over 1.5 million moms, dads, caregivers, really anyone vested in children's health to protect them from air pollution and the effects of climate change and toxic chemicals. So we have chapters across the country where we work with, parents on the ground and at the national level, as Dr. Sparrow was noting, to ensure that, we put folks in seats that they're going to be able to ensure the safety of our children, ensure that the health of families is prioritized in policies and regulations, so that we can have, a sustainable and livable future for our children. And so as it relates to air pollution, of course, we know that it's unhealthy for everyone, but it's especially detrimental to children's health. And as was noted, air pollution can trigger asthma attacks. It can interfere with normal lung development. Children tend to breathe more rapidly. They inhale more air relative to adults. They spend more time outside exercising. And so their brains and lungs are still developing. And with that interference of normal lung development, it has been linked to learning issues such as reduced cognitive ability. And as was noted with extreme heat, for example, there's a lot of children who both have homes without, air conditioning, but then they also may go to school where there's also lack of air conditioning. And so this has shown in numerous studies that there's decreased, test scores, that they just perform more poorly because of that extreme heat and being in those spaces. Additionally, with air pollution, there's been growing evidence between the link of air pollution and children's mental health. Extreme weather events not only cause physical harm, but those survivors of those types of events will also have intense psychological effects. And children will experience, climate anxiety, they'll experience stress if they've experienced a severe weather event. And this can actually lead into long-range mental health effects as they grow older. And in fact, one particular study noted that I think 75% of Gen Zers said that they had experienced anxiety, depression, or just feelings of being overwhelmed as a result of simply consuming news about climate change. So we know that the situation is dire, we know that it's here, and we know that it's everywhere, especially with social media. Our children are receiving, an abundance of information on the daily. But I think it is really critical, at least for us as parents. I'm a mother of 4. And, they range from age 7 to 14. So again, different levels of understanding and comprehension. But for parents, it's so critically important to start talking to their children as soon as they can. And there's numerous resources and materials out there, wonderful organizations who I'm sure we'll talk about later, who are leading the charge on how to talk to our children about climate change. But as Dr. Sparrow noted, how to provide them with hope, right? How to talk about those solutions, how to prepare them both in school and in the outside world to be able to tackle these experiences, because we know that we're all going to face them. Air pollution, you know, depending on where you live, you may live near a port, you may live near a highway, you may live near, you know, a refinery, a factory, whatever it may be, it's all around us. And especially when it comes to certain populations, you know, Latino, Black, Indigenous, low-income communities, they tend to be around, you know, greater sources of pollution. And so they have these compound effects in their communities, and children are experiencing not just issues, you know, from the air pollution, but numerous other factors that are impacting their health and well-being. So just to close, you know, I think we definitely need to see this as an environmental justice issue. We need to talk about it as an environmental justice issue and ensure that, you know, money coming, for example, from the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, that we're talking about those things, ensuring that we know about the funding, because a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of information coming our way and it's easy to miss. But there's numerous resources within both bills that provide funding to communities that are most impacted, and especially our most vulnerable, which includes our children.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, it really helps to bring us towards the policies and what we can do piece. Eric, I want to go to you now to help us understand this from your work in the Children's Equity Project, and I know you also have been deeply involved in working on that action plan. And I reiterate what Dr. Sparrow noted at the very beginning. Action is where we need to be now. And obviously we need to be talking together today to figure out how to prioritize our actions. But so glad to see that that's part of that plan. So I'll turn it over to you now, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Eric Boucher, he, him, his. I'm a first-generation college graduate. So my dad makes me say Dr. Eric Boucher, but you can call me Eric. Glad to be here. I'm coming to you actually from the beautiful, diverse Sonoran Desert here in Phoenix, Arizona. We've experienced some of the most excessive heat we've ever experienced due to climate change here in our community. We set a record this summer for the hottest and the driest summer with 54 days over 110 degrees and 133 days of triple-digit temperatures, which if you are someone who likes math, you can estimate that that's more than 1/3 of our year with excessive temperatures that directly impact young children, families, and all of us who live here in our community. Our cities and our states are looking at ways to adapt, as Dr. Sparrow talked about, some of those adaptations to address and mitigate the effects of climate change. But we also know that excessive heat, especially here in my community, disproportionately impacts vulnerable children and vulnerable Arizonans. So climate change is a very important part of my experience living here in the Sonoran Desert. I've also served as an early childhood educator and a professional for my entire career. So today I'm really bringing along my perspective of child development, and specifically as a person from a marginalized community, and from my research and my practical experience, bringing along my equity lens as well. So I want to share a little bit about my context so you kind of understand, well, what's climate change have to do? What does environmental justice have to do with childcare providers and those who provide care for young children in informal settings? So I want to share a little bit about my experience and how I got to where I am in my research today. I was a child growing up with a speech disability. I had early childhood special education services in my earliest years. And that early childhood education has directly impacted my trajectory for my entire life as a lifelong learner. My earliest experiences with qualified teachers and caregivers who made sure I was safe, made sure I was in a healthy environment, who made me feel a sense of belonging and a sense of connection, who instilled a lifelong learning in me. Those professionals who work in the field of early childhood education were the essential ingredients to my lifelong success as a learner. And so from my experience, I want every child to have that same experience. I want every child to, well, first of all, every child deserves to have a quality early care and education experience, and they deserve to have a space where they're safe, where they're healthy, where they have trusted caregivers who can build their bodies and their brains now, because that's important for the development now as children, but also which sets the trajectory for positive outcomes for the rest of their lives. Over 17 years, I've worked as an early childhood teacher. I was a preschool teacher and an infant toddler teacher. I had the pleasure of developing science programs, preschool science programs at a science museum, oversaw federal grants and Head Start programs. And over the course of my, especially the last 10 years, I've been engaged mostly in grassroots advocacy, really helping lift up the voices of educators and parents who are most directly impacted by policy decisions, and helping make sure that their voices are heard and valued as part of the conversation, and then making sure we secure those public investments in early care and education. So that I think that passion for joyful, responsive, supportive early learning environments has led me to research and policy specifically over the past few years. So currently now I work as a research professor of early childhood education policy at the Children's Equity Project, which is at Arizona State University. We're a child policy center housed at ASU, and we're led in partnership with scholars from 12 different universities across the country. We collaborate with more than 25 partners who bring a wealth of expertise in equity, funding, finance, inclusion and rights of children with disabilities, language justice and support for dual language and bilingual learners, culturally sustaining teaching practices, support for unique issues in tribal communities, gender equity, among a variety of topics. So our focus really is how do we create and support better and fairer early care and education systems for our youngest learners, for their families, and importantly for the workforce who is tasked with teaching and caring for them. How do we do that through policy, through practice, and through funding? So as you can see, it's definitely a good experience. It's a good fit for my experience as someone who really cares deeply about fair and equitable experiences for young children, and has that vision for all children, all young children, having a safe, healthy, trusting, responsive caregiving place so that they can build their skills as lifelong learners and be contributing members of our community. And I think that's why we're all here today, right? Is that we are working together to accomplish that through our early childhood advocacy and environmental justice. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Eric. And maybe if I could just do a quick follow-up for you, because I do want to reference, see if and I'm sure many may have questions around it as well. But do you mind just for a minute describing that action plan that we've noted a few times, or referencing, where it came from, the task force being pulled together, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So I highly encourage you to check out the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Task Force, the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Task Force. Our recent report was published, and as you heard, there's a webinar happening tonight on November 28th if you're interested in learning more. But on the website, there is access to the organizations and people who have come together to make this possible, as well as a report that was recently published that shows the research behind why climate change impacts young children's development and why that connection is important to make as those who care for young children, and then also some policy recommendations for federal, state, and local governments, as well as individuals like us to take action on behalf of children and families. So I highly encourage you to check out the report. I want to pull out a couple of highlight points, if that's okay. First and foremost, the report, and I think what we know from early childhood development, is that children's development is holistic. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens as a part of their physical, their emotional, and their social environments, and the relationships that they have with their families and their caregivers directly builds their brains and their bodies as lifelong learners. And we also know, and this is highlighted as throughout the report, that there are decades and decades of neuroscience, developmental science, education research that shows that children's experiences in their earliest years, and specifically their relationships and their environments, directly set the trajectory for positive outcomes and a positive direction for the rest of their lives. The things that happen in young children's earliest experiences from prenatal and birth through age 5 and beyond are directly and significantly impact their trajectory for the rest of their lives. The U.S. Climate Task Force, the U.S. Early Learning Climate Task Force talks about just remembering that this is an extremely essential and rapid period of development in children's earliest first 5 years, and that children are uniquely sensitive because of their growing bodies to things like environmental impacts, hazards, and exposures. One of the things that stood out to me in the the recent report that was released is that we can't, it's hard to overestimate how potentially damaging and harmful how it actually is harmful and potentially damaging for children's development, health, and well-being. And we also can't overstate how the potential impacts will negatively harm families and especially communities who are most disproportionately impacted by climate issues such as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in communities, children with disabilities or special health needs, children and families who are unhoused. They're disproportionately impacted by these negative impacts. So a couple of points that came out from the report. We know that for young children, that their development in their earliest years is an essential part of who they are as they grow up into adults. So we know that things like wildfire smoke or extreme heat have disrupted children's physical and emotional development. It limits their access to the outdoors where they can move their bodies and develop their gross and fine motor skills. It limits their ability to access nature and natural materials, which we know help calm and help connect children cognitively and emotionally with the spaces in which they're learning. We know that historic flooding has damaged homes, childcare programs, Head Start programs, and other places that families rely on for well-being, like pediatric clinics. And so those challenges that have resulted as a part of climate change directly influence and impact children's development. And I think most importantly, because first of all, children are humans, right? Children are like you and me, and so they deserve to have safe, healthy environments, right? To grow up in, to thrive. And we can't ignore climate change if we're thinking about children as holistic learners, as holistic developers.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So now I want to take our conversation to some of the connection points across some of these different areas, although all three of you have done a beautiful job already in making some of these points. But when it comes to really pushing forward and getting something done, we need more and more groups to be coordinating, recognizing the issues, but kind of working and coordinating with each other. And so I wondered if we might just start, and this is kind of a question, honestly, for any one of you to start with, but if we could think a little bit about what cross-sector collaboration can look like. Over the years, there's been obviously these intersection points we described here now, but there's also like the environmental justice movement kind of being in one space, and certainly I know the child development world the best, and there's already so many overwhelming things, everything from compensation problems for teachers and issues around teacher training. And so obviously there's a lot that one has to cope with in their own silo, but then we've got to figure out, we really have to crack this nut, right? And we've got to figure out how to work across these different areas. So what are some examples? What are some ways that we can have this coordination happening, that we can concede this kind of connection? And it may be that you are already doing a lot of this and you just might want to lift up what you're doing.
Well, I'm happy to start. And again, some great points have already been made. The early years task force absolutely is doing just that, is providing that collaborative space to bring solutions forward from different sectors. So really excited for everyone to tune in later tonight for that webinar and hear a little bit more about the report. But honestly, to what Dr. Sparrow, was alluding to earlier about having to, address the issue at hand and made those, references to, for example, treating the blood, making sure that we stop the blood from continuing. It's the same thing now. There's so many various issues, but if we don't have a livable world, really, what else are we doing, right? We have to tackle the issue that's in front of us, which is ensuring a future for our children, for future generations. And so I think with cross sectors coming together, I actually had the opportunity, I think earlier this year, May of this year, to join Too Small to Fail. This is by the Clinton Foundation. We joined that in a convening of philanthropists, people from various sectors. And actually that's where I had a chance to meet Ms. Federica Pereira, and I agree her book is fantastic, so I hope everyone gets that. But again, it brought together so many people in one room to have those hard conversations, to talk about how we're messaging, how we're communicating this information, how it's impacting our children, but at the same time, what solutions are we bringing forward? What solutions look like now, what they look like in 10 years, but the point is we have to start taking action. So I think the communication still has to happen, right? We still have to ensure that, we are providing these solutions across various sectors because everyone has their strengths. Here at Moms Clean Air Force, we really pride ourselves on providing, information that is accessible, that is in multiple languages, to ensure that everyone is receiving this information and has an opportunity to learn how they can take action, whether it's, as an individual, whether it's collectively in a group, or if it's at the local, state, or federal level. But we always are providing opportunities to take action, to prevent that climate anxiety from taking a toll on them. Because as is noted, to combat climate anxiety, we have to take action. We have to mobilize. We have to come together and see, what we can do to save our children. So I think that's a good starting point.
But I just add that I think it is about strategically prioritizing, because it is an emergency and it's easy to be overwhelmed with a laundry list of all of the different kinds of things that one could do. And in strategically prioritizing, to notice when the things that rise to the top of our priorities might not actually be the most immediately impactful. It might just be, it's the thing that we know how to do, or the thing that we care about, or the thing that we're funded to do. And I would say, notice that and maybe get out of the way. Don't pull the covers over to the thing that you could get funding to do, or that would fit with your expertise, and leave the funding and support for the people who are planting the trees in the communities of color that don't have adequate tree canopy cover, who are figuring out how to pull down the dollars from the federal government, from the Inflation Reduction Act, to better insulate childcare centers, to plant vegetal roofs on childcare centers, to grow trees around them, to put solar panels on them, so that if they do have to use air conditioning, they don't end up burning out the electrical grid, because then nobody's going to have air conditioning. Or in some places, it may be building to be able to resist floods. Some places are having to build up a level or resite themselves further away from the floodplains. But physical infrastructure to reduce carbon emissions and to be less vulnerable physically to floods and wildfires and hurricanes, et cetera, that's the high priority. That's where you're stopping the bleeding. We might, because we work with children, want to figure out how to talk with them about climate change. We might want, if we're therapists, we might want to do therapy for people who are anxious about it. But truly, what will leave our children and their children with a world that's habitable is focusing on reducing carbon emissions and building out adaptations that will protect us from the ways in which our climate has already been damaged. I think another way of thinking about this is about the international, national, local, neighborhood, family, and individual levels. What can you do at an individual level to reduce your carbon emissions? What's within your reach? Don't kill yourself, do something realistic. Don't drown in guilt about it, just do what you can. If you eat meat every day, try eating it maybe 3 times a week. If you eat meat once a week, try going to every other week. If you eat meat once a month, try, but just do something gradual, do a little bit. Think about how you get around. Can you carpool? Can you use public transportation? Can you share rides? If you're in the market for your next car, can you maybe get one that doesn't use as much gas, or maybe even a hybrid, or whatever is within reach? Can you insulate your home? Can you put solar panels? So there's those individual things. Different people will will have or will not have the resources to do that. But things like eating less meat will cost you less and will be better for your health. There's the neighborhood level as well, which might be advocating, with your town to get support to rebuild the infrastructure of your childcare centers or of your K through 12 schools so that they emit less carbon and so that they can stay open when it's super hot. And then for national, international policy, look at who's running for office and what they're really proposing in terms of policy, not whether or not they seem nice or, the ways in which they play on your hatred or fear, but what policies they're actually proposing. And when you think about the international sphere, well, let's just focus on the US, because the US has been the biggest contributor to harming the climate of any country on the planet. So it's really our national policy in reducing carbon emissions that is where, as voters, we can have impact. We may need a 501c4, which is a nonprofit that is able to do lobbying. And there was one like that for child abuse called Every Child Matters. And what they would do is they would give a scorecard to every politician running for office about what they actually did with funding for child protective services. So we might need a 501c4 that gives us a scorecard to look at what politicians who are running for office actually have done in terms of their voting record to reduce carbon emissions and who they accept donations from. I'm not sure that exists, but there are concrete things like that that are bigger than us as individuals, but that maybe we might encourage philanthropists to support rather than a curriculum on talking with kids about climate change. I get that kids are worried, but with limited resources, again, we got to stop the bleeding first before we start doing therapy.
Yeah, I don't know, Eric, if you wanted to add anything onto that, and I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I would say that these intersections are extremely powerful because of our community, right? That we as individuals have the power to use our voices to advocate on behalf of what we believe all children deserve, right? Which is a good, safe place, thriving place to live as they grow up. And they also deserve that now as children, because they're children now and that's what they deserve, right? Then I also think about just how powerful our voices and our efforts are when we unify them together. Both of my parents served in the United States Air Force. And so part of my experience growing up was we're all part of a community. Everything that you say and do, every action that you take, every interaction that you have directly impacts everyone's well-being in the community that you're in. And so I think growing up that continue to reinforce that idea that the work that we do, we should take some action, of course, as individuals, but just imagine how powerful we can continue to be with our voices and with our votes, especially, right, as we think about what young children deserve as they grow up. I do want to think about the workforce specifically here and how that intersection of what childcare providers, Head Start programs, or other kind of education providers can do to support and enhance children's experiences. First and foremost, we need a strong, well-funded early care education system across the United States, first and foremost, and then in states and in local communities. We don't have that currently right now. And so investing in the places where children spend a lot of their time, right, a childcare program, investing in making sure there's qualified educators to be well-trained in providing supports and mitigations and adaptations for children's health and well-being in those spaces, having money available to retrofit spaces for air conditioning or insulation or other things that programs could use to adapt to the changing climate. That investment is significant and is needed. And it's also inadequate on its own. We know that families need their basic needs met in order to thrive. Research shows that we have to address children's health, families' access to healthcare and mental health care, looking at clean water, drinking water, safe housing, access to nutritious food. All of these things help families thrive and help children thrive. So I think about, from our perspective, there are policies and levers that we can start to think about adjusting or improving that help meet those direct sort of adaptation needs for children. So I think about childcare licensing, for example. Childcare licensing is an important lever that could help us address some of those environmental hazards and prepare children and childcare providers to be resilient and to have mitigation against some of the harmful effects of climate change. So if you're not familiar with childcare licensing systems, they're sort of the regulatory bodies and states that are tasked with setting consistent health and safety policies across licensed providers, and especially for those who teach and care for young children. So, for example, Liz talked a little bit about the harmful effects of poor air quality, right? That children might develop asthmatic symptoms, right? That there's things that happen to their body as a result of being exposed to poor air quality. And we know that exposure to those kinds of higher environmental toxins have a particularly strong, right, impact on very young children. But despite all of the research, we also know that across the national database of childcare licensing regulations, that air quality is not an indicator that we look at to determine if states are addressing things like the quality of air indoors and outdoors, right? And so I think knowing the research is, knowing what the research says about children's development and knowing how harmful things like poor air quality can be for young children's lifelong trajectory, we might ask ourselves things like, well, can an early childhood setting be a safe and healthy place for children if it doesn't address air quality and other factors that that are impacted by climate change? So I kind of think about that, those policy levers that at the childcare provider level, at least, that programs could be doing their part, right, to make sure that children really have these safe and healthy places to be, and that state agencies are also thinking about what resources can we provide to ensure that the paint in the homes before 1978 is not, doesn't have lead in it, or how do we make sure that the furniture isn't emitting chemicals because of the way in which it was made, or how do we make sure providers are trained to know how to address the air quality index so that they know when children should be kept indoors from going outside, or how do we have the funding available to build out spaces indoors so that here in Phoenix, for example, if it's too hot to go outside, we have a space where children can still develop their physical development, right? The piece that they need to thrive.
Yeah. So one thing that just listening to you all, this is just so helpful and important. It's occurring to me is that, and this goes to this prioritization point that Josh has been making, is that there are those there's things that we can do as individuals and childcare providers and schools as well can do, and then there's the really big kind of advocacy push that's needed. And I'm wondering if that's where the coordination is going to be the most powerful. I mean, maybe this is kind of obvious, right? But this idea, Josh, that you mentioned of some sort of, I don't know, scorecard, this has come up in some of the action plan recommendations as well. This idea of like, how can we get a handle on whether they're the politicians out there or different pieces of legislation, like what's really going to drive us forward, and have multiple organizations and groups coming from many different perspectives kind of sign on, promote, and develop those kinds of things. Will that help to move things forward from an advocacy point of view? And I'd be curious about each of your reflections on that, and if there are some of these initiatives already underway that we may need to know about and help to lift up.
Can I jump in, because I'm afraid I have to leave at the top of the hour? Just to give you one example, a friend of mine who actually was all about early childhood decided that she was going to get out of early childhood because she's worried about our planet and her children, her children's children. And so she is one of the people behind this bill that Governor Newsom signed in California. I put the link into the chat, which is going to require large corporations to accurately report on their carbon emissions. Many corporations are doing greenwashing, like Delta Airlines says, oh, we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. Well, what are they doing between now and 2050? Are they going to start in 2049? So there's greenwashing. This bill, though, is an example of, the kind of policy which is in reach. Now, granted, it's California. Not every state is like California, but California is the 7th biggest economy in the world all by itself. So this is a huge win to have a requirement that corporations are held accountable for transparently reporting on their carbon emissions. So just an example of, the kinds of policies that we might push for that are not inside of early childhood. But as people who care about children, we care about the planet that we're leaving them. We care about their children. So I think we can be passionate advocates, even if people think that's getting out of our lane. You know what? I think we need to sort of move out of our lane to support this kind of movement. And I'm gonna have to say goodbye. Thank you very much for bringing this to the early childhood world. And I look forward to working with all of you on this, because we got no choice, we got to do it.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh, very much for being here with us. Maybe I'll piggyback on one thing that he said, and I'd love Eric and Liz to get your thoughts on this as well. I mean, I come from this also from like an old reporting background, journalism, storytelling. I'm just wondering if some of the stories of the impact on children are part of the advocacy answer. And if you've already seen that there's power in helping people who are in decision-making positions to see how much this is affecting the next generation, of everything from their physical health to their mental health to their intellectual capacities, right, and their cognitive abilities. So is that something that either of you have seen? I'm assuming actually you've been able to use a variety of these kinds of stories to help push your message.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an organization, Moms Clean Air Force definitely focuses on climate advocacy. And we've certainly seen time and time again when we meet with our elected officials, and of course, our messaging is coming from the perspective of a parent, of a concerned family member, or anyone who is, again, invested in their children's health and safety. When we share those personal stories of impacted family members, if our organizers themselves are impacted, that's really where we see kind of that shift in their perspective, and they get it. They understand that the situation is so critical, and that they have to push for policies that are going to help our communities, and especially those communities that are most impacted. And we've seen, this year alone, the EPA coming out with so many different grants, different groups that are focused on making this change. And actually, the one that really got me so excited this year was actually just recently the launch of the National Environmental Youth Advisory Council. And so this is a committee of young individuals, I think ages 16 to 29, who are going to be advising the EPA administrator on issues of environmental impact that are affecting youth. So I think, as Josh was saying, everyone really has to be part of this equation. There really isn't time for anyone to sit out. We have to get uncomfortable in these spaces, to be able to grow and find solutions together. And I think it's really powerful to kind of put that power into youth's hands, right? Because they're the ones that really are growing up with this. They're the ones that have experienced it. They're the ones that can really share the learnings that they've seen, what's worked and what hasn't. Our youth have been at the forefront of all kinds of social movements over the years. And really, I think we need to empower them. There's actually, I think, at least two different policies currently, two legislations currently focusing on greater youth education around climate change, and one to support mental health on youth who are impacted by climate change. So we have to take a look at those legislations and support them, encourage our elected officials to co-sponsor them, and just keep pushing. We have to keep applying the pressure because it truly will impact all of us, and our elected officials work for us, and they need to hear from us. And so really, it's going to take all of us to be part of this movement.
Thank you for sharing that, Liz. And I really appreciate how you brought up the Youth Climate Council. And that makes me think about the important role that those of us who are, all of us, right, but those of us who are directly impacted by the policy should be the ones leading and driving and collaborating on determining and identifying and passing the policy, right? So I think about parents of young children, early childhood educators and childcare providers, Head Start providers, those who are going to be directly impacted by policies related to environmental justice and other issues that affect young children should be the ones centered in and driving and included, right, as part of that process. The other thing I was thinking about too was stories are very powerful. Stories are probably one of the most, I'd say, impactful pieces of our experiences working in with lawmakers and early childhood advocacy. We often share stories of the joy and the excitement that happens in a infant classroom or a toddler classroom, right? We often have parents share about their challenges accessing quality childcare, and or when they are able to access quality childcare, what the benefit has been for their own economic and mental well-being as parents. So I think the story piece is exceptionally powerful because it helps paint an image of what is actually happening in local communities for children. And I also think about stories about what could be possible. I think we, in my experience at least directly, I often talk about the challenges like, this group of children, 40% of these children are experiencing this challenge, right, in accessing quality childcare, for example. But I also think it's important to focus on like what could be possible, like what do we envision for our children, and telling stories of that, what that looks like, what it could look like, and what it does look like in local communities. Each person in our community has knowledge and strength and ideas and a vision for what that joyful experience looks like for children. So I would say we also should focus on that piece of lifting up what could be possible and not just what's always been, for children.
I love that. And actually, that maybe brings us to our last question. Then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So I'm glad to see some questions are coming in. But this idea of kind of let's think about what is possible brings up kind of what is next. What is on your mind? So for both of you, what are some things that are next on your plate that get you excited and animated? And are there opportunities for collaboration and connection in those upcoming what's next?
Yeah, well, I hope that everyone watching really does, take this opportunity to see, all the wonderful people who have added their comments. There's so many organizations out there who have particular skills and expertise and resources that can be shared. There's numerous community-based organizations, like Dr. Sparrow noted, that need the support. There's a lot of funding out there, like I mentioned, from the Inflation Reduction Act and from the bipartisan infrastructure law, but we need people to, one, be aware of them, but two, a lot of our communities need the support in being able to, write the grants and actually go through that process. So I think there's a lot of areas for collaboration, especially in those spaces. I think someone may have noted, technical assistance. There's grants out there now, who offer that, that offer assistance for that. There's technical assistance centers. But again, it's helping people connect the dots to those opportunities, to those resources, to that funding. And I think, again, it has to be collaborative. So if you see an organization that needs X, and you can offer it, I think that's really a beautiful space for us to be able to collaborate for the future. So I encourage everyone, again, please reach out to us or anyone else who may have participated in this webinar today.
Yeah, and I'll give I think I'm most excited about the collaboration moving forward, that it's not just early childhood educators, parents of young children, and people who directly interact with our youngest learners. It's for the early years climate task force, it's philanthropic organizations, early childhood nonprofits, major nonprofits with members across multiple states and communities. And so there's power, I think, in our voice and power in our action together. So I'm most excited, I think, about, I'm going to continue to say updated on the work that's coming out of the task force, and really paying close attention to how at the national level that could impact what we're doing, at the state and the local level, and then helping continue to build up, educators, parents, other community champions, as people who can speak up and on behalf of young children and demand, that we need investments in early care and education, and we need to think about the holistic impacts of climate change and other hazards on children's potential, their optimal development as they grow up. And then I do want to make a plug. We at the Children's Equity Project are very much steeped in the sort of intersection of research, practice, and policy. So we often are putting out great research around certain topics that relate to thinking about policy, but through an equity lens, and how we can really think about restoring some of the harm that's been caused by inequities around racism, sexism, and other inequities in communities, and how we might do better by children and by communities through policy and practice. So just to plug, an upcoming report in the next few months we're putting out is about the childcare licensing landscape that I mentioned in my comments, and thinking about how we can create spaces that are safe, healthy, and optimal learning environments for young children that can directly help to address some of those climate change hazards that programs are facing as early learning providers. So stay tuned with the Children's Equity Project for lots of great resources specifically focused on equitable policy and practice.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Sounds, yeah, very helpful. And I was just reflecting as both of you were answering that there's also so much power for our kids and for our next generation in giving them the models that both of you have just laid out, like helping them see that adults are taking action, or that younger, that teenagers are getting involved in these youth councils, and that there are moments of bringing people together, and there's collaboration, and there's an ability to kind of help to bring kind of data and story together to help other people see what's possible. And all of this, no matter, for the youngest kids, obviously they're not quite getting all of that yet, but as they're growing up, they're seeing these models of organizations like yours doing this work, and that itself can be an antidote to the depression and the anxiety that youth face today when they feel like there's nothing that can be done. So as the mother of two young college-age kids who have some of that, like, oh my gosh, the anxiety of these models are really, really important. And so I thank you for them as well. So let me go now to some of the questions that are coming in. It's great to have the engagement on the chat. Thank you all so much for providing the resources that you have. We have a question from Christine. She asks, would anyone on the panel be able to talk about climate vulnerability surveys for early childhood programs? ECE programs need resources to help them understand and assess climate change needs. And this is a recommendation from the action plan. So I'm curious too about these kinds of surveys, and if you all have any experience with them or anything, and you might be able to shed some light on that. Eric and Liz,
I do not, so I'm going to kick it to Eric.
Liz, I also do not, but I do want to say, let's do the research to figure it out together. But we have a wealth of folks who have been on the call, and a wealth of folks in the community who have that knowledge. So let's do some research and figure it out together. Yeah.
And I know this is a super small thing, but it occurred to me as we were talking about everything from, tree canopies to, what's available in the physical infrastructure of our childcare centers and our early learning centers and our schools. Even doing those kinds of inventories in our communities seems kind of a key part of these kinds of surveys. I don't know if that's part of what those climate vulnerability surveys are about. But if those of you who are listening and could add anything into the chat around this too, I think we'll all be that would be very welcome and helpful to us. Yes, Eric.
Yeah. Well, I could say, I think as a researcher, I may not know the answer, but I know how we could potentially get the answer.
Right,
so I would say, definitely checking with your state health department or your local health department. They may be involved in some of that work, so that might be a good place to start for sure. And then definitely looking up at the national level. Obviously, the Early Years Climate Task Force has some great resources and reports available on that website. And then I would say reach out to folks that you work with, childcare agencies like childcare associations, potentially your state's Association for the Education of Young Children. NAYC has many state affiliates that might be doing work in that realm. So I'd say reach out, build some of those partnerships. And if you still aren't able to find the answer, at least you've had a connection, and now you have someone that you can collaborate with on continuing the work together.
Right. Another question's come in from Tamara, who asks, have any organizations created a program or event for the youth to learn and interact with each other in some way about the impact of mental health in their environment, whether it's around pollution, mitigating the effects, or any other topic related to environmental justice? I don't know if that's maybe, I'm curious, Liz, in your experience, I mean, I know your group is parents, but if there are programs where parents maybe are also interacting around these issues, that would be very interesting to hear as well. But this is a question about whether there are programs or events for youth. that connect on these issues.
Yeah, and the name is 100% escaping me right now, so I'll have to pull that up and make sure it gets in the resources for afterwards. But the 2 resolutions that I previously mentioned, those were actually led by a youth coalition, and they're called Schools for Climate Action. So I definitely encourage folks to look them up. These are students from across the country who have come together to demand action from their policymakers. And so that really gives them a space of, kind of controlling some of the solutions that are coming out that are going to impact them. So Schools for Climate Action is definitely one, and I will follow up with the name of the other group that I can't think of right now.
Yes, no problem at all. And I think also this question, and I don't know that we have the answer right now, but I think I wanted to just note this asks about the impact of mental health and their environment as well, and whether youth are learning from each other or interacting with each other about those issues. It does seem like youth can learn from youth, and peer learning can be a big part of this. So it raises some really interesting issues just within that question. We got another question from Ed, who asks, what are some of the perspectives about Black Americans who may tend to feel left out of the conversation around climate and the transition to a clean energy economy? There's been little research until recently exploring climate sentiment in the Black community. There are also proportionally far fewer Black people who work in this space, minimizing visibility and making inclusive solutions harder to implement. Do you all have any thoughts on that?
I can point to a couple of organizations that are top of mind when it comes to Black Americans. And now her name escaped me. I think it's Black Girl Environmentalist. She's also a youth herself, and she's actually part of that National Youth Environmental Council that I noted earlier. She was selected as one of the inaugural members because of her work to, again, empower Black women specifically in this space, and to provide that space where they feel included as part of the movement. And another one that comes to mind is We Act for Environmental Justice, another powerful organization that's been around for a while, who is, again, ensuring that there are seats at the table for the communities that have been most impacted.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz. That's great.
Well,
oh, yes, please, Eric.
I appreciate that question. I think one of the important things that I read in the comments that I think is important to highlight is that, especially with vulnerable communities, we often talk about the challenges or the negative effects that happen as a result of racist and inequitable systems. And we don't often lift up the joy and the knowledge and the resiliency that often comes from that experience and from that community. And so I think one of the things we think about is how do we make sure, I think that relates to that idea of how do we make sure those who are most directly impacted and have the knowledge and the values in the community can be the ones centered and leading the work. So that's one point that might be important. It doesn't have to deal directly with Black adults, but some of the work we've been doing around lifting up and supporting the joy of Black children, and especially Black boys and Black girls, through some of our National Head Start work could be of interest as people are thinking about how what could be possible, right, if we imagine more equitable systems and fairer systems for young children. So I highly encourage you to check out the African American Boys Project from the National Center on Development, Teaching, and Learning, which is the Head Start Center. And then we're doing some work around Black girls and joy in Black communities as part of some of the work the Children's Equity Project does. So definitely check out our cep.asu.edu website, and we've got some publications that'll be coming out specifically around children and lifting up Black communities and communities of color, specific to early learning. But I think the idea of making more visible what could be possible, right, and what it actually looks like for fair and equitable policies, that could be of support.
Thank you, Eric. And I do think this is such an important question, as it just points to representation on councils, in policy making, of course, all the way up and down from local, all the way up through our national and international policies. There's got to be much more of that as well for Black Americans, for our Indigenous populations, and for so many. So we've got 2 more questions. Betsy is asking about training, and for those who may want to develop training, for example, librarians, and the training that they may want to do around this topic. And this is an area that I've very interested in, as well as somebody who at New America has been looking at libraries and the impact and needs within libraries. So I don't know if either of you have any ideas around this, and if there are some funding possibilities for those who want to build out some trainings, whether they're for librarians or teachers. I'll also just add that in my head, and you guys might be thinking this too, are some of the words from Josh, our panelist who couldn't stay with us, right, about where to prioritize. I find that to be a very hard point to make because of the importance of curriculum around these issues and how much we all just have to learn. But I would love to just open that up to either of you around how we build out some training for teachers, for librarians and others, and where to find funding for that.
Well, maybe importantly, with my advocacy hat on, thinking about electing people who believe in supporting and investing in training and education for educators and those who work with young children and parents might be a good start to do the research, figure out what the policy priorities are for your elected officials and making decisions as a voter, right, on those who will support and invest in childcare. And then secondly, there has been some work around children's librarians and museum staff as well through some of the national partners. So I might recommend checking out NAEYC, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, has some good articles and resources from their peer-reviewed young children journal around community engagement and training and resources for librarians and others who work with children outside of like the childcare context. That might be a good place to start as well.
Yeah, and some of you might see a poll coming up. We're going to keep going with some questions, but feel free to jump in and finish the poll as well. As we're starting to wind down here, but I think your point, Eric, just a minute ago about going to the source for when you think about what it looks like and to train teachers, librarians, and others, and within particular local communities, what they really need to know about, want to know about, what they already might know, where their real questions are. I know we've done some work around this when it comes to like digital media and training, and first asking questions of like, what is most on your mind right now? What do you most need to know? It's often different than what the experts think one most needs to know. And that can be a starting point, perhaps, for some of these conversations around climate change and the environmental issues that affect children in their learning. So let's see, I think I've got one more question, at least one more here from Colleen. She asks, how can advocates better connect the effects of climate change to early developmental environmental hazards like lead, air pollution, heat, et cetera? Many of the issues that we've already talked about here, but how can advocates connect these effects to this larger kind of climate change conversation? She says it feels like there's a competition for resources in those spaces.
I'll definitely say there's an abundance of resources, but I definitely encourage you, and I'll put in my plug for Moms Clean Air Force. If you go on our website and click on resources, there's so much information, whether it's a fact sheet or webinars we've done in the past, just a number of resources to exactly make that connection, between the health impacts of environmental change, of environmental impacts, climate change, on children's health. And I'll also make a plug for our program called Eco Madres. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but that's a specific program within Moms Clean Air Force that focuses on Latino communities and ensuring that, again, there's language access and there's accessibility and resources, because we need to ensure that everybody is aware of the impacts and then what steps they can take to mitigate those, and how to, for example, talk to your legislators. It can be a scary thing to even pick up the phone and call someone to ask them to vote on something or vote against something, but we help people walk through those different scenarios, right? Or writing a letter or providing testimony before EPA. Again, we just make it as simple as possible for everyone to take part in this. So again, I encourage you to go to our website, reach out to us, and there's always an opportunity to do something at different levels. We have organizers, like I mentioned, across the state, quite a few in Arizona, who work with their local communities, to create those spaces, to hold informational, just let's talk about climate, right? Let's start by talking about climate, and then that network just starts to grow so that we ensure everybody is part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add, the research hasn't changed. The data hasn't changed. Like, we know that children thrive when they have quality, safe, healthy early learning environments. The research has shown that for a very long time, right? What's changing, right, is our context and our climate. And so I think, armed with the research and the data about the benefits of creating safe, healthy spaces for young children, whether you're talking about making sure we're mitigating lead in water and in paint and in buildings, or talking about making sure we're addressing the flooding that'll happen, or that is happening, that's affecting communities, right? Whether you're talking about any of those issues related to children's health and safety, it is about healthy, safe environments for young children. That's what I think we can all agree to, and we all believe in. And that's, I think, the unifying thread. So the research is the same, right? The research shows us that's what children deserve and need. And so it's, I think, adjusting maybe more about the talking points to specific climate change issues that are happening in local communities that might lift up or enhance that argument. But the argument is the argument, right? That children need quality spaces to thrive, for optimal development.
100%. Thank you all so much. I wanted to note how many great resources have been dropped into the chat as well from many of those who are on this webinar with us. A big thank you to those who've added materials in addition to the folks from the wonderful GLR group who've provided links. And it can feel overwhelming at first, but it's moments like this where we can kind of come together and talk about it and just start referencing things together, that feeling of overwhelm can kind of fade away, and there can be more of a sense like, wait, we can pull this together. We can totally do this. There's a lot of really good stuff out there already. There's some really good examples that we can put forward. And I do think that having that feeling of agency and being able to move forward for all of us who are in this world of child development and learning is so important. So just a big thanks to our panelists for just incredible ideas and providing us a great model for moving forward. So I'm going to turn it over back to our Campaign for Grade Level Reading folks and to finish this out today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lisa. And I also want to echo your sentiments. Thank you to Eric and Liz and Joshua for joining us today. I think this is a really wonderful start to what I hope will continue to be a flourishing conversation at CGLR. And thanks to everybody for joining us today, for your questions, for your comments and responses in the chat, as well as the Q&A. I just want to remind everybody to take a look at our calendar for upcoming events. We've got a few more here between now and the end of the year that I hope that you'll join us for. Thanks again to everyone, and we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day. And for those of you who end up on the related webinar this evening, I hope that it's equally as informative. Thanks again, everybody. Bye.